Good morning. I'm honored to have you here for this presentation. I'm Dr. Duncan, and I'll be presenting on the effects of an Afrocentric United States history curriculum on Black student achievement. So had the clip actually worked, what you would have seen, if any of you have ever watched the Dave Chappelle show, he had a clip of a man named Clayton Bigsby, and he was a blind African-American man who was a white supremacist. He had no clue that he was not white because he had been raised to be such. And that's what you would have seen. Though comical, that clip showed an extreme illustration of what can happen when curriculum actually promotes a racial hierarchy. We had a blind individual who was unaware of his own ethnic or racial identity. He was taught that people of his own hue were criminals, miscreants, devoid of history and of identity. In United States history classes everywhere over the US, this type of curriculum is promoted. In fact, the fear of inclusion is so deep that several states, including Texas, Arizona, North Carolina, have garnered national awareness in the attempt to stem the push for a more inclusive US history curriculum. Included in the rationale is the fear that the newer, more inclusive, and I argue more comprehensive curriculum would be inaccurate and would somehow fail to meet the standards that are accepted federally, statewide, and district-wide. The fear, however, is rooted in two very sad assumptions. The first assumption is that the first curriculum that we currently have that negate the contributions of people who are not part of the regular hegemony is somehow comprehensive, and that it has met the proper standard of teaching, learning, and preparation for a global and competitive future. And the second assumption is that somehow the inclusion of these other stories, the sanctioned histories, their integrity would somehow be challenged if these other histories were included. First, I'd like to disclose some preconceived ideas that led to my pursuit of this study, primarily the achievement gap. As I'm sure you're aware, the achievement gap in education refers to the disparities in academic performance between groups of students. This gap does not only show up in standardized test scores and grades, but also in dropout rates, in the types of courses that are selected, and in college completion. However, when the achievement gap is discussed, it is usually code word for African American and Latino students' achievement against those of their white peers, many times irrespective of the income. I began to think about our education problem similarly to the pharmaceutical industry. If everyone remains well, Big Pharma goes out of business. Therefore, one has to wonder how the richest country in the world can validate a blatant and pervasive achievement gap that has persisted for decades. One has to ask why instead of how. After all, if we know that there is a correlation between the lack of academic achievement and involvement with the criminal justice system, why wouldn't the United States want to invest in programs that would most easily treat and possibly remedy the rates of imprisonment of Black and brown persons? While the U.S. has perhaps 5% of the entire world's population, it holds a whopping 25% of the world's prisoners. According to prisonpolicy.org, 2,500 Blacks per 100,000 or 1,000 Latinos per 100,000 are imprisoned, as opposed to 400 per 100,000 of whites. This would be acceptable if imprisonment were an equal opportunity punishment, not in any way related to access of proper education. However, when the prison industrial complex, that's what I call the jails, has become a $30 billion plus industry, the paltry costs and benefits of educating a population that has been marginalized since the beginning of America's inception may not actually be a priority. This begs the question then, is the monetary profit to maintain an inequitable system of education worth more than the moral imperative of making sure that this country is one nation with liberty and justice for all? When educators and legislators discuss this achievement gap, discussion seldom turns to the historical, legislative, documented, and purposeful beginning of the achievement gap. In 1819, the Missouri literacy law forbade assembling or teaching slaves to read or write. In 1830, the Mississippi employment law forbade African Americans employment in printing and entertainment. In 1832, both Alabama and Virginia literacy laws fined and flogged whites who would teach African Americans to read or write. 1833, Georgia employment law prohibited African Americans from working in reading or writing jobs. They also would fine and whip blacks and whites for teaching African Americans. In 1842, Maryland information law felonied African Americans who would demand or receive abolition newspapers. And in 1857, the Dred Scott decision of the U.S. Supreme Court dehumanized and disenfranchised African Americans. Historically, minorities, specifically blacks in America, have struggled to attain parity in treatment by the law with whites. The inequitable system was created by the non- and miseducation of blacks in America. Because the only means by which blacks could attain parity was through proving academic acumen, which had been the history of Africans in antiquity, the United States created a nation and legislation that purposely kept blacks from receiving proper education. When blacks were permitted to be educated, either by other blacks or by whites, many were educated as to preserve the status quo, thereby reestablishing and legitimizing their lower caste position, as it were. The national problem is that black students are still undereducated in literacy, math, and science, as evidenced by their underrepresentation of persons achieving associate degrees, only 12.8%, bachelor's degrees, 9.8%, master's degrees, 10.4%, first professional degree as an MD, DDS, or JD, 7%, and doctoral level degrees, 6.1% for the 2009-2010 year. The specific problem as it relates to this study is that black students perform at the lowest level of achievement on standardized social studies exams. Black students have scored disproportionately lower on assessments of higher order thinking skills, such as standardized social studies examinations due to cultural insensitivity in instruction, poor instruction, minimally qualified teachers, and weak literacy instruction. Lower standardized test scores held by black students feeds the negative stereotypes concerning black children. The specific problem for this study was that black students were performing poorer than the other racial groups on criterion referenced and teacher-created United States history assessments. Lower performance of black students on U.S. history assessments, unfortunately, is in line with the national trend of student achievement on U.S. history assessments. The subliminal yet guiding question for this study was, to what extent has United States history curriculum participated in knowledge and information creation that results in the preservation or normalization of America's racial hierarchies? The phenomenon may be identified as intentional racism. Intentional racism creates a deplorable environment, places individuals within that environment, and then claims that the survival mechanisms practiced by that population are endemic to that population and that population alone. Furthermore, intentional racism transforms racist ideologies and creates legitimate knowledge and facts by canonizing this information in sociology, anthropology, biology, and social studies. When these facts are challenged by those victimized by them, challengers receive similar reaction to the religious heretics during the Inquisition. So the background of the problem was race and whiteness, racism in education, post-traumatic slave syndrome, curriculum and curricular design, American history curriculum, Marzano's taxonomy, and servant leadership. I'll touch on each very quickly. Race and whiteness deals mainly with Peggy McIntosh's idea of white privilege, and how often, though you may see what your so-called race or ethnicity is, you don't always see how it affects you and how it affects others, or how you might get a privilege solely based on how you look and not necessarily on what you're able to do. Racism in education, we've actually already gone through the legal things that happened with that. Post-traumatic slave syndrome was a term that was coined by Dr. Joy Leary DeGruy. And it says that there has been an intergenerational transfer of racism that started with slavery, and it has gone on through schools, through the justice system, through everything that we see in the U.S. With the curriculum and